thank all of you for coming to this wonderful lecture that we have today. I was given a brochure about the fair housing poster contest. We have some of those brochures up here on this table as you leave. The Fair Housing Council is doing a wonderful job in terms of promoting equity in the area of housing, and we wanted to support them. And they asked, could we share this with you? So we have those, and you can get them on your way out. I'm going to give a short introduction today because this is such a fascinating subject when it comes to what has happened, particularly to African Americans in Portland. And it really is an extension of what we've been doing over the last couple of years in terms of looking at local history and focusing on local African American history during Black History Month with our program. We had a full reception for Vanport survivors last year. We're kind of extending that with the upcoming reception this Wednesday night, February 9th at Kaiser Town Hall, as we get a chance to look at some exhibits, not only of Vanport, but Giles Lake Courts, Fairview Homes, and also Albina, where we grew up, and look at the history of those communities and what happened to the people in it, particularly the impact on African Americans. Today we want to really focus in on what happened in the area known as Albina, particularly around the area of Emmanuel Hospital. When I talked with Felicia about what I should say about her, she was wondering what my interest is. Well, I lived at 116 North Monroe. That's the corner of Monroe and Vancouver. That's one block north of Vancouver Avenue Baptist Church that was actually given that name by my grandfather, the late Reverend Roosevelt Rogers. So we weren't in the group that got bought out, but there I was watching what happened personally. So I wanted to really hear what she could add from her research to the history that I had actually lived as an African American living next door to Emmanuel Hospital, like some of you having been born there and everything else and growing up in the neighborhood. I want to tell you a little bit about Felicia Williams, and first of all I want to thank her because over the last 3 years she voluntarily has become a part of our Black History Month committee and helped us as we wanted to conduct more research and bring this information to you. She is an instructor at Portland State University's Black Studies program. She originally is from North Dakota? South Dakota. And after spending some time in the service, she came out west and she obtained her bachelor's degree from the University of Portland, and her master's in history from Portland State University, and has been working in critical programs like the PDC Civil Rights Project, trying to capture this history from us who have lived it, and before, you know, we're gone, and bringing it to the community at large. So with that, I'm going to let her come and share a little bit more about her background, but please give a warm welcome to Ms. Felicia Williams, Portland State University.
Thank you all for being here today. This is really exciting. Last year we did more presentations as well, and last year I focused on the Martin Luther King Jr. Street renaming and the skinhead movement. This year it's kind of a nice switch because I'm focusing on Emmanuel Hospital. And Donnie Adair mentioned the Kaiser Town Hall event that's happening on Wednesday night. And at that event there will also be more photographs on posters of the Emmanuel area. So if you want to see more than what's included here, because they have a lot of different ones. So be sure to check that on Wednesday night. For starters, I want to do a special thanks to the Portland City Archives. All of the photographs and maps that you're going to see today come directly from the Portland City Archives. They're all part of the Emmanuel Urban Renewal Area and the PDC files. From now on, I'm going to call the PDC, Portland Development Commission is PDC, so there's no confusion. I'm going to start by talking about the history of African Americans in Portland. Originally, this area right here, by the train station, was where the bulk of the African American population lived. The Broadway Bridge opened right here in 1912, causing people to move across the river. The Black community settled mostly in Lower Albina, and there was some areas down along here with Southeast Tibbetts. But this is where you start getting the real shift in 1936. It's not accidental. In 1919, the Portland Realty Board established restrictive housing covenants, and the other thing that they did was signed ethics that all of the realtors had to adhere to in not selling property in white neighborhoods to non-whites. So they set aside a specific neighborhood specifically for minority populations, Native Americans, Chinese, Japanese, African Americans, primarily right here. So there's also a significant Japanese population in Lower Albina. So as you can see from this map of 1936, this is where the bulk of the population is, right around the Memorial Coliseum area. And that did have to do specifically with, that's where the Portland Realty Board would sell property. So, just to give you a brief explanation of what redlining is, it's basically when the banks and the insurance companies would take a map and literally draw red lines around neighborhoods, and they would refuse to give housing loans or business loans within that neighborhood. Insurance agencies would do the same thing and say they wouldn't insure any property within that area. So that does create definite housing constrictions. This is a 1938 photo. Right here is the Steel Bridge. Here's the Broadway Bridge. This is where the Memorial Coliseum is today, the Rose Garden right behind it. As you can tell, it's kind of a mixed neighborhood. You have a lot of kind of industrial buildings and a lot of residential. This is all pre-urban renewal. So the way that it looks then is much different than the way that it looks today. There's no I-5. There's no Memorial Coliseum. So it's quite a lot different. So everything kind of changed. It was called World War II. And in World War II, 1941 to 1948, the African American population increased in Portland by roughly 15 to 20,000 people. But because of residential segregation, there were only a handful of places they could live. They could live in the wartime housing projects, Giles Lake, Fairhaven Homes? Fairview. Okay. Thanks, Tanya. And Vanport. I'm sure you guys all know what happened to Vanport, flooded in '48. And the other housing projects were also closed. So after 1950, what happened is all of that African American population that remained got pushed directly into this area right here of Albina. And it's hard to see on this map, but this tells you non-white housing in 1960 in Portland. The darker it is, that means 90% or better. This is what's called hyper-segregation. So post-World War II, all of the non-white residents in Portland are more or less right there. So, the next thing that happens is urban renewal. The first major project is the Memorial Coliseum. The highest density, right here. It's the first one to go. So, Memorial Coliseum, all of this gets wiped out, pushes the population north and east. And this is what keeps happening. I-5 in 1964 opened up, same time as Memorial Coliseum. Again, push more people north and east. So this is kind of the situation that you have existing in Portland with the population getting pushed. So the next area is to figure out where is urban renewal going to happen next. The Central Albina study in 1962 was undertaken by the PDC. They were the main organization getting federal funding for urban renewal plans and urban renewal projects. And one of the major ones that they did was Central Albina. They were looking for a way to kind of decrease residential areas and increase industrial usage. South Auditorium, this whole area around here, was also a major PDC project. The PDC in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, most of their approach was kind of a slash and burn mentality. Get rid of all of the housing, get rid of all of the businesses, and start over. It's really scorched earth. And that's what their plan was for Central Albina. And as you can get a sense, they were focusing on this area because it was predominantly black. They happened to use Negro and white interchangeably in a lot of their reports. This was just the mentality that they had. So Emmanuel Hospital happened to be the largest employer in the Central Albina area after the Lower Albina got wiped out for the Memorial Coliseum. And in 1963, they commissioned a report from a consulting firm out of Minneapolis, Hamilton and Associates. And basically what they were trying to do was figure out how to improve their business model. And so Hamilton and Associates looked at where they were located, right next to I-5, lots of freeway access, flat ground all around it, and said, okay, you can improve your business model because your competing hospitals are OHSU, up on the hill, which has limited parking, limited freeway access. Good Samaritan, also limited freeway access, limited parking. So they suggested that what they should really do is focus on working with the city to get rid of all of the black neighborhood around there and create parking lots. And they did pinpoint it as a black neighborhood. They described it as decadent, and they didn't want undesirable encroachments. They specifically said in the report that they did not want more black residents moving into the houses around Emmanuel Hospital. So they strongly suggested that Emmanuel's board of directors work with the PDC in getting rid of all of that housing around there. And 1962 Central Albina study, you could tell that's where the PDC was going. They were looking at a way to redevelop the area. So these are the buildings. 188 buildings were affected. And what the PDC could use is the term blighted. In 1949, Housing and Urban Development came up with the term blight, or came up with the proper usage, and if a neighborhood was deemed blighted, then it was okay to literally disrupt it and just completely tear it down. Blight is kind of a tricky term because, as one of my colleagues, Tanya, pointed out, blight could mean things like a clawfoot bathtub or having high ceilings rather than dropped ceilings. Another example was if you had a garage underneath your house, that was considered blighted. Any houses over 50 years old, considered blighted. So this was just kind of the mentality they were working with. They were very loose in the way that they applied it. They said 160 houses, 96% of them were blighted. Again, very loose determination there. Businesses, 92%. This gives you the racial breakdown of the houses and the individuals, the households that were affected. It wasn't completely a black neighborhood. There was a lot of white residents that had been there for a long time. So this did have a total impact within the area. So the PDC assessed a lot of the businesses. And I thought this was an interesting quote, because they talk about influx of junk stores and marginal retail operations of a questionable nature. So that led to kind of an interesting question. What kind of businesses were there? There were 6 apartment buildings, a battery charger repair shop, a bicycle shop, 3 body shops, Lou's clothing store, a food store, a garage and service station, a glass store, a pipe vendor, a plating shop, a pool room, a restaurant, a rug cleaner, a tavern, trailer rental store, 6 churches, Blessed Martin Nursery, and a teen club. But they were all considered marginal or junk shops. It's kind of interesting. There's one of your grocery stores. But one of the things that did happen, again, because of redlining, you couldn't get business loans in a lot of areas or home loans. So that did decrease the amount of money that people would invest into their businesses and keeping up the houses and the buildings. And what's interesting is a lot of the photographs, you can see how some of the upper portions are actually empty. A lot of businesses had burned down because of bad electrical and bad wiring. The business owners in the city didn't bother to clear them up. This is a common practice in this area. So one of the things to kind of consider is the difference of reality versus rhetoric. And Thomas Robinson, another colleague of mine, brought this up very effectively. When you are limited in where you can buy a house, you're more likely to keep it up as well as you can, because there is pride in home ownership. However, when you do have an institutional system that prevents you from getting money to invest into your house, you are going to see a decline in property. And that becomes really important. Here's your Emmanuel Hospital. Here's the neighborhood around it. What's kind of interesting about this photograph is the empty spots. Emmanuel Hospital was in the habit of buying up lots when they became available. So they didn't need the PDC initially because they could just buy up the properties. And they did pay fair market value for those properties that they purchased. The PDC did not. So this is kind of interesting because you can also see some of the buildings and houses around there. Again, because the area was a mix of commercial, industrial, and residential, that was also considered blighted because the PDC did not like having a mixed usage neighborhood. They want pure residential, they want pure industrial, they want pure commercial. No mixing and matching. So one of the other things is the housing and urban developments had a plan of dispersing minority populations. It was considered desirable. But they also had limits on where people could live because they would not support giving home loans, FHA loans, to neighborhoods that were non-white. They wouldn't allow racial integration. So you kind of get a catch-22 here. So Emmanuel Hospital decided that they're going to go ahead and push through the plan. The PDC supports it. There's their slash and burn. This was it. They wanted to acquire all of this property and literally wipe out all of the housing and businesses on it. That's their master plan. And that's what they did. But part of the way that they did it is by saying that better than 90% of all of the stuff in that area was blighted. So we have a little bit of a wrench thrown in here because there's a Model Cities program and the Albina Neighborhood Improvement Project. And the Model Cities program and ANIP were able to tap into rehabilitation cash from the PDC and from the federal government to go in and fix the houses. So they were able to fix all of the houses right here, down here, everywhere else. PDC said absolutely no way can you spend any money in this area. We will not allow it. Because the PDC was determined to get rid of all of the housing and businesses in that area. So ANIP and Model Cities were able to do a hell of a job rehabilitating all of the housing around it, but weren't allowed to touch any of the properties because they were slated for demolition. And the PDC was determined to push it through. So here's an example of some of the houses that was actually in there. Because the PDC was determined to push everything through, you had a real conundrum because there were going to be a lot of displaced people. A lot of residents, especially the minority residents, weren't necessarily going to have any place else to go. Because restricted housing covenants, while they were outlawed in 1948, they were still in place. The Portland Realty Board would not sell houses in white neighborhoods to any minorities. This was really common. It was going on as late as 1975. So this is a very real problem. The Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association stepped in. They organized in 1970 and said, hold on, you need to take into consideration what's going to happen to the people who are displaced. And there had been some lip service to that in some of the PDC grant requests, but they had a list of housing projects or housing options available for the displaced. Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association took the city council on a tour a lot of those locations and found that they didn't have electricity. They didn't have running water. Some of them had already been condemned. And this was still on the list of appropriate housing for the people who are going to be displaced. And then there was also a question of funding. How much money would people get for their loss of property? What would renters get? What would homeowners get? Because the PDC was lowballing property owners, and that was a serious problem. So the Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association did step in and say, look, you need to be more proactive about that, and they slowed it down because they sent a formal complaint to the Housing and Urban Development, to HUD, and HUD said, okay, slow down, you need to actually take a look and see what kinds of housing projects are available for people to move to. And they did slow it down, but unfortunately it's hard to turn a ship when it's going at full steam. And so a lot of the houses were already torn down. So this creates a real conundrum. They were able to come up with some better options, and they were able to get funding settlements for a lot of the residents. I think that came down to something like $1,500 for homeowners for relocation costs and something like $1,000 for renters. And the businesses also got cash too. I know there's some people here who would be able to speak to that better than I do. They know exactly how much money they got. But the Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association did slow it down and make sure that there was some sort of equity that was going into place. But it didn't really much matter because all of the land was cleared. And in 1973, Nixon cut the budget and the hospital fell through. So this massive hospital that they wanted to build became very small, and a lot of the land was left cleared for parking lots, exactly like the Hamilton report had suggested they do originally. Get rid of all the houses around it, create parking lots. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. It's kind of ironic. To give you a sense, this is the impact of urban renewal. Professor Karen Gibson estimates about 1,100 housing units were lost for urban renewal. Yeah, 476 for Memorial Coliseum, 125 for I-5, Emmanuel Hospital. There was also more houses that were lost for I-84 and that was constructed and for the Lloyd Center. So urban renewal had a major impact. In 1972, Mayor Neil Goldschmidt wanted to shut down the PDC, in part because of the backlash against the Emmanuel Hospital project. But as you know, he didn't succeed in that. But this was the last major urban renewal project in Portland where a slash and burn mentality was employed. After that, they started doing a little bit more cautious kind of approaches to it. But this left a lasting legacy, because the people that we interview for the PDX Civil Rights Project talk about Emmanuel Hospital, and it left a deep scar. And a lot of people are still angry with the way that PDC treated the black community. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time, because I really want the people who lived in the Emmanuel area and who were affected by that to kind of share your thoughts on this. But it is important to remember that this was the way that the city government operated, and it's important to look at the legacy that that created. So thanks for your time. Donnie say a couple words, because you actually worked for Emmanuel Hospital in the 70s.
Right.
So
well, not in the 70s. I didn't work for them until the 80s, I guess. And the thing I shared with Felicia when we were talking about it a couple of days ago was that at that particular time, the administration of Emmanuel Hospital, whenever I guess I became a de facto community relations person. I mean, you got Pam over there now, but I was working out of human resources as an equal opportunity specialist later on, director of labor relations. But I became the de facto minority community relations person because I was working on volunteering with the Urban League, chairing the Urban League board, and these kinds of things. And whenever groups came and needed anything or wanted anything from the hospital, it was just a routine request, like the Black United Front was seeking information on sudden infant death syndrome. Well, I wasn't connected with the medical side. They said, Donnie, Ron Herndon wants this information. I was like, give it to him, but it was really resulted from two things. Not only the way they got the property, but there was a class action suit in employment discrimination that was brought just prior to my coming to Emmanuel, and it did have a positive effect on Emmanuel and its hiring practices. In fact, the lady didn't win the class action suit, but she did win the retaliation suit. But as a result, though, they started taking note of their hiring practices and hiring many more people of color and that kind of stuff. So that was my purview from the inside for 1 decade. But I'm more interested in it, like I said, as somebody who was born at Emmanuel Hospital, lived across the street, and watched the destruction of the neighborhood and my friends leave and that kind of thing. And we never knew why and didn't understand how they were afforded that protection to just take a neighborhood and do that to them. The other part of it is some people did benefit a little bit in terms of getting over into other areas of Northeast Portland into some better housing. But I think that was a minority of people because my other grandparents were right on the freeway, so they didn't get bought out by Emmanuel, but they got bought out by the freeway. So, but we were directly impacted by what Emmanuel did.
So are there any kinds of questions?
Well, I'm curious what you said, a class action suit ban for hiring practices. Did anyone ever try to get any legal recourse? Or I'm assuming that a lot of this was claimed through eminent domain, right? And you said they didn't pay fair market value. So, as we know, for most middle class or working class people, we are the mechanism we have for wealth development has been home ownership. So I wonder how much wealth in the black community was lost through the businesses being destroyed, the homes being destroyed, and if there's a way to calculate that, if anyone's ever tried to seek reparation for that.
That's kind of an interesting question, because one of the things that was taken into consideration was relocation costs and how much they should be paid, homeowners and business owners should be paid. And part of the factoring that went into the PDC's decision of how much everybody should get paid was based on the amount of money the businesses brought in over the previous years, but, you know, they considered them marginal. Yeah, and so the same thing happened with the homeowners. As I understand it, the Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association did file some sort of legal action against the PDC and filed a complaint with HUD in order to make sure that the money that was coming in was higher than what was originally stated, because it was lowballed. Unfortunately, because of the federal laws governing HUD in 1949, they could do eminent domain. It was perfect within their legal recourse. And so they got the city council, because the PDC worked with the businesses, and the PDC worked with the city council hand in glove, literally hand in glove. And so what happened is the PDC would say, we need this area to be renewed. And then the city in 1964 passed a resolution saying that the area was blighted and it was an emergency and it could go ahead and be wiped out. So as long as they use their emergency powers, they could do that.
And just as an aside, I believe the PDC still has the capacity to do eminent domain. It's less
Yes.
politically popular now, but in Lens, it was the first urban renewal area that they delayed the addition of eminent domain while the community worked on some negotiation with PDC, but they said they would not do an urban renewal project without the option of eminent domain.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Supreme Court upheld it recently.
Felicia, I was gonna ask, and kind of open up the floor to members of the community that might have something to share or thoughts that came, that might want to share with us their perspective. Sir? Just tell us your name, if you would, and whatever you'd like to share. I think we've got
Good afternoon. For all the people that know me, my name is Harvey Rice, graduate of Master's in Urban Studies from Portland State. I own a duplex at 628 North Monroe. Got wiped out by Emmanuel, but I didn't suffer that much. But my mom lived at 312 North Knox. And what happened to her, I actually hired Mr. John Terran, an attorney. We did go to court. What happened was, someone came by, my mom was buying the house on a lease option. Someone came by her house in a suit, she said, she didn't get a car, and told her that since Emmanuel was going to be buying up all the property, she did not have to pay her rent, which on the lease option, we pay the rent and goes towards you. So after the 120 days was up, she was served with papers that she had lost her lease option. Well, meanwhile, you know, in your families, you know, you always have an older brother who knows more than anybody. Well, but I have a degree in real estate finance, a bachelor's degree. So my mom went to my brother, who had worked at the hospital. So sure, he was good at what he did, but he didn't know anything about real estate. So when I did hear about it, I got involved and I went to court, and the judge believed us and said that somebody had set my mom up, and so the judge says, I can't undo what has happened at this time because it's too late, but you can live in that house for a year without paying any more rent. So she did live there a year, so she didn't get any relocation, so she got to do something. Okay, thank you.
And that actually brings up a really important point. I don't know if you guys have read Karen Gibson's article, Bleeding Albina, but it's an incredibly important article. And one of the things that she mentions in that article was that there was a lot of predatory lending that was going on by three main companies. Dominion Capital, Franklin Savings and Loan, and Lincoln. And what they would do is exactly what Mr. Rice talked about. They would go in and tell people that they were getting a lease to own on the house, and after the people died, they would find out that the family would discover they didn't own the property at all, that they had literally just been leasing it for decades. And this happened to a couple of my students. Their grandparents had gotten trapped by that. So this is a really common occurrence. And when I was going through the Emmanuel books at the PDC, it has pictures of all the houses and descriptions of who owns the house as far as the lease, and you see the same names over and over again. So this was really common, this predatory lending.
When I first joined the city a long time ago, I'm an old timer now, but I talked to the old timers then. And one of the surprising things I heard was that you know, all the sales for the Emmanuel project, you know, they were coercive because the PDC had the power in they, but no one could point to an example of their actually using it. So I was just wondering, does anyone know of a community member that actually, you know, didn't take the lowball price and actually went to court to have them settle the price in an eminent domain proceeding?
I didn't come across anything like that. It could have happened, but I haven't come across anything like that in the records. Because they were able to get the property by the city council's emergency action.
Well, they, you know, you either have a willing seller, a coerced willing seller, which I understand was what was really going on there, or eminent domain from an unwilling seller. And I, you know, try as I might, I could never come up with an example with a third. And I find it surprising with that many displaced people, no one challenged PDC.
They did challenge them through the Emmanuel Displaced People Persons Association, but again, the challenge was, the ball was already rolling.
Said, okay, I'm not selling, I'm staying here. You know, but no one did that as far as I could tell.
In South Portland, they took away the certificate of occupancy. You got the fire department come in and get your house. And I think they probably did that as well in those same files.
They probably
So what would happen before the eminent domain power came in? For the fire department, walk in the house. You were supposed to open your house to 3 appraisers. People often didn't allow those appraisers in. So you might also not allow the fire department in. If the fire department takes away the certificate of occupancy, the eminent domain comes because you are living in an uninhabitable building.
So,
and I did see something in the PDC files where if
PDC files has
somebody
a lot of this.
didn't allow a PDC member to come into their house, then that meant they lost all of their rights automatically. They were considered uncooperative.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I came in late, so I don't know if you mentioned this, but it's my understanding that the Emmanuel destruction was Emmanuel legacy. I-5 was the federal highways, but a lot of people don't know that Memorial Coliseum was supposed to be on the west side, and it was Portland voters who voted to put it in the neighborhood that it was placed. So it's not always government agencies that did this destruction. This is the citizens of Portland.
But that was a business group that ran.
Yeah, the east side business group.
Because they wanted straight out to their lawsuit.
Yes, that's true.
There was this gentleman in the green shirt. I think he wanted to say something from the.
Oh, yes.
My name is Harold McLaurin, and I'm well over 70. And the reason I have to state that is because I went to Trinity Lutheran Church and School. Some of you might know where that was, where it got burned down a couple of years ago. But the school was there. I attended that. I attended Jefferson. I went away to service, and while I was gone, all of this happened. And my brother, Phil McLaurin, some of you might know him, worked for Mary Leo Goldsmith. So I have a tremendous history of what Portland is all about. People, I stay low-key, to tell you the truth, so a lot of people don't know about me. I came home from the service after spending 20 years. I hate to say this, 100% disabled veteran now. For 20 years, during the Cold War, I spent it all over the world doing what I could to so-called protect. When I came home, I went to work for First Interstate Bank as a loan officer. I did that for 5 years. I bought a house on Mount Scott that had restrictions. This was in 1976 to 78, somewhere in that area. So those rules and laws were still in there by the real estate board. My story is quite a long one, and if anyone is really interested, I'll be glad to sit down and talk with them at any time. One final thing. I noticed that you said that Emmanuel paid a fair price, a pretty fair price for their houses. Well, Emmanuel is a Lutheran affiliated hospital. I don't know if many people know that. And the area that I lived in had a lot of German Lutherans. That's the school and the high school, and I knew a lot of these people. So the whites that got displaced in that same area got a pretty fair price for what they had. The others, people of color, did not.
Yeah, I guess that's true. That is true.
My name's Brad Perkins. My company's called Perkins Realty. So I'm familiar with this because I grew up in the Irvington area. When this happened, I was going to Gresham High School. I was unfortunately having to be a gopher rather than a grant general. But I witnessed something similar to this, not so much race warfare, but class warfare down in Eugene with the destruction of the downtown. Same methods were used down there as to eminent domain. Even business owners that didn't want to move had to, because they didn't follow they were considered blighted. Okay. Coming back to this neighborhood, which I love, I live here now, I'm still very concerned about the existing situation that we have here, because I think this is at the root of a lot of people's concern about the type of activities that happened in the past. How might we learn from that and move on and make it maybe a positive thing that we can change? The land's still sitting there. The land is still not being used to when it should be. When I say that, I mean the most important business section was there at the corner of Russell and Williams. To me, it was a historic landmark that was destroyed. And I think probably a couple other houses could have been because of the cultural significance, not so much the architectural significance. That was what I studied, architecture when I was young. But get to my point is that I did my best to try and deal with the Emmanuel Hospital hierarchy and coming to terms with this situation and say, what, come on guys, come around, you own the property, $5 million worth of dollars through the Model City program were basically given to you by having this property today. And talking to a couple of attorneys about this, that is a concern that maybe somebody that has been negatively impacted that still lives today can bring suit. And I'm not saying that we should bring suit, but I think that that is part of the stick that can be used if they don't understand what the carrot is. The carrot is give the property back to the community, let the community decide what to do with it. If it means having something medically built there that can be of help to get the Jefferson High School students to be involved with medical program there as part of their education, so be it. Get the businesses back there. Let's get it back to where it should be, because I believe that it's a real gray area here as to who should be the proper owner here. PDC used and HUD used their muscle to make the deals happen through eminent domain, but who ends up with the property? It's not publicly owned, it's privately owned. So I think the issue is still there. Okay, and I'd like to hear your comment on that. What do you think is possible here for the future of this, of what happened in the past? I mean the remaining bare property that's still there. I think one is being used for gravel parking lot to do high-rise buildings.
I'm not a lawyer, so put that out there right now. But the feeling of shock that I got when I opened up this blue confidential folder in the PDC files, that was the Hamilton report that said that they wanted to wipe out this neighborhood to create parking lots, and I read that and I was like, I can't believe this ever made it into a public archive. Why wasn't this shredded? Was my thought. It doesn't seem like something that they probably ever wanted to be public. But that was one of the questions that immediately came to mind just after I was looking at this. Like, I wonder what kind of legal ramifications there are today, because there is the documentation that does demonstrate that the whole purpose of the Emmanuel project was not to build more hospitals, but it was literally to build more parking lots. And,
Can I speak on the what we could do? My name's Wendy Wright. I formerly worked for Portland State University. I actually study how cultural resources can be best managed and have done studies of best practices for that. And I've met with planning department, Dan Saltzman, I've met with a lot of folks to show them both the carrots and the sticks. The city has yet to move on that. They're consistently not in compliance with cultural resource management laws at the state and federal level. I specialize in archaeology. They consistently blow up archaeological sites, which are often all that are left of working class and other less elite culture, per se. So there are definitely ways to go about it, both with sticks and with carrots. Heritage tourism is a big industry. We could make a lot of money in the city off of that, and we could also take them to court, big time. So, if anyone's interested, you can talk.
Who would you be taking to court, city council at the time or the PDC today?
I would say you'd be working off of what they're doing today. That's mainly what I know, what they're doing today, because there's National Historic Preservation Act of 1968, which is much like the National Environmental Preservation Act, and then also all states have a state historic preservation office that has guidelines. The city is a certified local government. They get money for, you know, this sort of stuff. They should be doing a better job. They consistently only look at architecture though, and they never seem to care about cultural landmarks and cultural significance.
this one might be a little bit tricky because the official